human resources, human capital, people, and culture. This single vocation has many names. HR professionals are responsible for what is arguably the most critical success factor within any organization. It's talent. HR Studio Podcast brings you interviews from HR and industry thought leaders so you can listen, learn, and leverage. Welcome to HR Studio Podcast, building the next generation of HR leaders. HR Studio is brought to you by A.J. O'Connor Associates. To learn more about our sponsor, please visit ajoconnor.com and be sure to check out the AJO blog for additional HR learning tools and resources.
Welcome, everyone, to HR Studio Podcast. My name is Linda Halavic, and I'll be your host for today's conversation. Our topic today is one at the very heart of what seems to keep many CEOs up at night. They are perplexed by the lack of innovation and creativity within their organizations. In fact, according to the 2017 PwC CEO Survey, the issue of innovation is the number one priority on the minds of many, many CEOs across the world today. In fact, 77% of CEOs struggle to find the creativity and innovation skills that they believe they need in order to grow and transform their businesses. Well, we are fortunate today to have Dr. Amy Climer with us, who is absolutely going to help us understand this entire area and dynamic and help us as HR practitioners to perhaps help our clients internally improve in this area. Welcome, Dr. Climer, to HR Studio.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. It's terrific. You have, and still are, a teacher to teams in the area of creativity and innovation. You are an expert in this area, if I will say. You are a trainer and a coach, and you also develop teams specifically. So you kind of handle all audiences. You have earned a Ph.D. in leadership and change from Antioch University. And I believe as well you are certified in creative problem solving, in immunity to change, which is very intriguing, and in the Foresight Thinking System. It's terrific to have you with us here today.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Can you start us out with your view of creativity? What is creativity and why does it matter to businesses today?
Well, the definition of creativity that I often use is creativity is novelty that is valuable. And so what that means is basically novelty, meaning something different, original, unique, and it has to be valuable. Now, it doesn't necessarily be financially valuable, although in a business context, that's usually one of the main concerns, but it's that it is valuable in some way. It could be like an emotional value. It could provide some new insights, but whatever it is you're creating, that there's value and that it's novel. And when those two things are met, then we generally say, yeah, it's creative.
That's really intriguing. Can I ask, how did you find yourself in this space to start with? How did you become an expert in creativity and innovation?
I think I've always been interested in creativity. I mean, I can remember in high school having conversations about creativity with my art teacher and trying to understand why some people feel like they're creative and some people don't. Yeah. And then I actually kind of set that aside a bit and went into the field of outdoor education and student affairs in higher education. Nice. And so through that, I got a lot of exposure and experience in working with teams and developing leaders. And I started infusing more of the creativity into that. And eventually about, 2011, I went and got my PhD with the intent to study creativity in teams in the context of leadership. So I'm intrigued by that.
I would imagine. Sounds like a great space to be in now based on, what, frankly, PwC has recently surfaced. But can you talk a little about the role of leaders? You just mentioned you studied creativity within the context of leadership. What role do leaders play, Amy, in the area of developing, building, nurturing creativity and innovation?
I think one of the biggest things leaders do as far as innovation is what's their response to it. So how do they respond when ideas come up when their peers or their people they're supervising, when they bring up an idea, what's that leader's response? Are they like, oh, yeah, okay, let's explore this more?
Yeah.
Or like, yeah, no, that's going to not work. It's too expensive.
Yeah, we thought of that already and it didn't work,
Exactly,
right?
right?
Yeah.
You know, and I think that the culture that leaders play a role in creating has a big impact on whether or not creativity is alive and well, or if it's being squished on a regular basis. So I think one thing is the culture, and I think the other thing is the type of processes that leaders facilitate and bring into the organization. So what I found is that most companies, somewhere in their vision, mission, values, somewhere it says that they want to be creative and innovative.
Yeah, you're so right. Yeah.
But then when you ask them, like, oh, well, how do you all do that? They don't actually have a process in place. Just like, well, I don't know. We just try to be open. We
have suggestion systems, right? All those things, yeah.
We got a suggestion box in the far corner.
Yeah, right. That's what I'm
saying. So that's what I do is I teach teams that a process that they can use so they can tap into that creativity at any time, because we all have this incredible potential to be creative. And it's critical for organizations.
No doubt. And it's critically needed. So let me ask you then, Amy, do you believe that everyone has the capability to be creative, but that the surrounding systems and environments don't encourage it, don't nurture it? Okay, so all of our listeners on this phone as HR practitioners, if what I just said is true, what's your opinion of what they can do to help their organizations, if that's a fair question, to foster more creativity? You know, what do you think?
Absolutely. So, yes, first, I do believe that everyone has the capacity to be creative. I think if you just look at human history, like we're just wired to create things. We make things. I mean, that's why we're able to like have this podcast right now, because somebody made this possible, you know, the equipment.
Yeah.
So I think we're wired in that way, but something happens usually around elementary school where we start looking at ourselves differently and saying, no, I'm not creative. And often we think we relate that to our ability to draw, which is actually, you know, often I'll ask people like, oh, why don't you think you're creative? And they're like, well, I can't really draw that well. Well, creativity is a lot more than being able to draw. In fact, that's not really important at all.
Wow. Isn't that funny?
Yeah, you're right. So I think then we come into adulthood and we work at an organization and we have these beliefs about ourselves that we've picked up over the last, 15, 20, 30, 40 years. And so I think for HR leaders, it's about helping people pull out that creativity. I think one of the things that HR leaders can do is saying yes. So when ideas come up, not necessarily saying, yes, we're going to definitely implement that idea, but yes, I'm curious, like, let's talk more about that. Let's explore that more. And when people share ideas and they get a yes response, they're more likely to share other ideas. Maybe the first 10 ideas don't work and, you can play with them a little bit. And you're like, maybe this isn't the best fit, but you keep going. And eventually you might get to that amazing breakthrough idea.
Yeah. So it's interesting. It sounds like it's, we need as HR professionals to encourage leaders to say yes, to your point. We also need people to take risk and to be a little bit tenacious. I mean, I don't know how many times, Edison, you may actually know the number. How many times did you try to light up a light bulb and it was probably like number 857 and it finally happened? So I guess there's an element of tenacity. Is that a correct assumption on my part? Amy, do you find that in this process too?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think that tenacity, that resilience, and part of that is really figuring out what is it you're trying to be creative in. So in this example of Edison, he's like, okay, I have this vision, this idea for a light bulb. How do I make that happen? And so he's trying all these different approaches. And if you're looking at the creative problem solving process, the very first stage is figuring out what are you doing? You have to clarify the actual problem. In this case, how do we get light to everybody's home? And that tends to be more effective if you can clarify that problem versus like, oh, I don't know, let's just be creative.
Okay, great.
I call that the blank canvas effect because like, I don't really know what to draw. I don't know what to paint. I'm staring at this blank canvas versus you're saying, want a painting of an elephant. Oh, now I've got like 15 ideas on what that might look like.
Okay, well, that's a great point you make because I do think a lot of people in general think creativity is just a blank slate and it should not be structured. I think what I hear you saying is an element of structure helps people to be creative. Can you talk a little more about that? That might also be something our listeners can, go ahead and start using, right? A little structure is helpful, yeah?
Yeah, definitely structure is helpful. And there's a balance there. Like you want some structure, but not so much because, the whole point of creativity is to come up with something new and original. So one of the structures that I often put in place when I'm facilitating, and I teach teams to do this, is to differentiate between convergent thinking and divergent thinking.
I see.
So divergent thinking is generally what we want to do first, where we're like just going big and broad, and we're coming up with all these ideas, and we're not judging them yet.
Okay.
Then after we have some ideas, 50 to 100 ideas, however many is appropriate, then we switch our brains into convergent thinking, and we start evaluating and sifting through the ideas to see which ones are the best ones. And I think one of the things that happens is that people try to do both of those processes at the same time, and it actually is less effective. So if you've ever been in a meeting where somebody said, hey, I've got this issue, can we spend a few minutes brainstorming?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And then people start sharing ideas, and about the fourth idea, somebody says, oh, no, that's not going to work.
That's
We
true.
tried 1985, and it was a complete disaster.
That's right.
That person is jumping into that convergent thinking.
I see. Yeah.
They're doing it from a place of caring. They want to make sure, they're worried that idea is going to get implemented. But if they know, okay, we're just dumping the ideas, we're going to evaluate them soon. If they know there's a time after, then where the evaluation will happen, they can relax. They can just be in that divergent thinking, and things can flow a little bit more, as opposed to them stopping the whole process.
Yeah. So, again, you're suggesting a little bit of loose structure and facilitation so that people can be free and perhaps safe to take some risks. Amy, can you talk about then, once you, I guess, have convergent thinking, how do you go through the decisioning process then of selecting options? Is that a place where there has to be some loose structure as well, or what's your experience there, or advice for us?
It sort of depends on the context, but sometimes I'll have groups develop some criteria of, what are 3 pieces of criteria that they want to evaluate these ideas against. Okay. Sometimes you don't even have to get that detailed. Often I'll just have groups, maybe take little stickers, like little round dots, and say, okay, everybody gets 3 votes. Put your sticker on ideas you think are going to best fit or best solve the problem. And people kind of intuitively know without having to go through all the criteria.
I see.
And then that just helps us look at, okay, what are the ideas that have risen to the top? So there's 100 ideas on the wall.
Yeah.
These 10, let's look at these 10 in more depth. I don't necessarily use that as like a democratic process of like, got 5 votes, now one got 4. No.
Yeah.
It's like what rises up. And then start evaluating those a bit further and develop those ideas.
Okay, good. So again, I keep repeating, but a little bit of loose structure helps. Because I do think that perhaps why we don't see enough of this in organizations is because people may be under the false assumption that it is this process that happens on its own and it doesn't need any support or any nurturing or any facilitation at all. And you're saying that's not true.
Yeah. So there's just a quick introduction of some research.
Great.
The 1940s is when brainstorming first came about. It was invented by this guy, Alex Osborne. And since then, in the 50s, 70s, and 90s, there have been all these studies around brainstorming of like, okay, well, does this really work? And a lot of the studies have said actually brainstorming is not that effective. But if you dig into the details of the study, what you notice is that brainstorming is effective if there's a facilitator. Sure. And if there's a process in place, and there's a few other criteria, but having a facilitator actually helps people come up with more ideas and better ideas than they could either by themselves or in a group without a facilitator.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. Makes great sense. It seems like brainstorming was the beginning of divergent thinking.
Well, at least in the written process.
Yeah,
I mean, we've been doing this since humans have been alive, of course. But
agreed. Yes. So okay, very good, interesting. My last question, Amy, about this area is this. loose structure, some facilitation, some risk, and leaning in. All those things are required. There also seems to be an element of selflessness, or setting one's own ego aside as the facilitator or the leader in order to generate a certain environment. Can you talk perhaps about that? Because again, our listeners on the phone have internal clients who are business leaders, and their personality, I'm sure, is just as impactful in these kinds of meetings and discussions as it is the process that they're trying to implement. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think ego's big. And I think I try to always, when I'm trying to be creative or if I'm working with clients, I try to help clients think about what is the ultimate purpose. And generally the purpose has something to do with the organization. You're trying to help the organization, make more money or serve clients better, or whatever it is. And I think, first of all, it's all about continually reminding, okay, this is about this purpose. What is our why? Why are we doing this? Yes. The other thing is when a team is coming up with ideas, sometimes there is a tendency from team members to, maybe there's 5 or 6 ideas that have been laid out, and people want to give credit to other people for the ideas. Like, oh, this is Linda's idea. Let's talk about Linda's idea. Okay. Well, that's usually coming from a place of I want to give credit where credit's due. But what happens is that it actually prevents us from wanting to adjust and change that idea. And it prevents from owning the idea. And so when people are sharing ideas, it needs to be coming from a place of I'm putting this out on the table and this is for the team. This is not for me. And what's interesting is that, I think a lot of times if you really look at people who are successful, they're often very focused on their team and helping their team succeed or helping the organization succeed. And so the ego ends up backfiring on us quite a bit.
Yeah. That is a great, I guess, tip that you share, not to label ideas and tie them to people, because that does limit. That's a great perspective. Thank you for sharing. Amy, we could talk for hours, I'm quite sure, but unfortunately we can't do that. But how can our listeners learn more about you, your research, and your offerings in this very, very critical area facing many business leaders today?
Sure. Yeah, they can go to my website, which is climerconsulting.com, and Climer is spelled Climer. And I also have a podcast called the Deliberate Creative Podcast, and that podcast is focused on teaching leaders and teams how to be more innovative and creative.
Very good. Thank you for that and for your time and all of your insights. It's a very, very exciting space that you're in. And then perhaps we'll talk again, do another podcast in the future.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me, Linda.
You bet. Great to talk with you. Take care, Amy. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to HR Studio Podcast, building the next generation of HR leaders. To download the show notes and discover additional information from this week's episode, please visit hrstudiopodcast.com. To join the conversation, we invite you to visit our LinkedIn group, where you will connect with a growing community of current and future HR leaders.